Hi, everyone. We're talking to Bryan Sentes today. He runs the excellent Skunkworks blog, which I'll link to in the description to this video. So, Bryan Sentes, why don't you give us an introduction into your background and what the links that you've seen with UFOs?
Okay, well, I don't have a very pertinent background to UFOs per se, um, other than I grew up in North America, where of course it's part and parcel of the culture. It's in the air. I was born in Saskatchewan, which is a province in Canada. I studied English literature and philosophy for my undergraduate studies, and I studied English literature for my graduate studies. Around 1994, again, because of the way things were in the air, because of the talk about alien abductions, because of the popularity of the X-Files and so on, for some reason, it all kind of came together for me. And what struck me was that all these countless stories about flying saucers, aliens, abductions, and so on and so forth were a kind of collective dream, if you will, that expressed the anxieties and aspirations of our technological society, which has been facing increasing pressures and problems, not just since the advent of the atom bomb, which is, of course, what Jung puts his finger on, but of course, with the advent and increasing severity of the ecological crisis and global warming. So that was in 1994. As a poet, what struck me was that I wanted to use this as a material and work it up into a long epic length work that would sort of foreground this dimension, this meaning that I saw. But because of the people I was hanging out with, around 1999, the opportunity came to deliver a paper at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion that was happening here in Montreal. And I collaborated with a friend of mine, Dr. Susan Palmer, on a paper on the Raelian Movement International. And there we pursued the thesis that what made the Raelian Testament, the Raelian Revelation, persuasive, as far out, as marginal as it might seem, was that what it proposes, what it values, is precisely what is valued at the heart of the so-called advanced societies, which is that everything is going to be resolved by technology. Technology solves the problems that technology gives us. From that time, okay, I sort of kept on with what I was doing, and then finally, to sort of keep myself honest, I sat down to start this blog. I think it was about 2018. And I figured, well, if I go public with my thoughts on this, I'm going to have to sort of start producing. Things went in a slightly different direction than I had originally imagined. And now the blog sort of deals with sort of reading all these stories about UFOs, abductions, and so on and so forth, and engaging with the discourse in various ways, trying to peel back this sort of fascination, this fetishization with technology. One of my targets of late, although I've given up on that, has been Avi Loeb. As an astronomist, as an astrophysicist, I'm sure he's at the top of his game. But if you've had the misfortune to read anything that he's written for Scientific American, or most recently in The Debrief, where he ventures further afield, you see a lot of the sort of assumptions and presuppositions that I'm at pains to reveal and criticize.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that these assumptions and what you allude to as the technological basis of UFOs and the techno-fixation of society, or at least so-called advanced society, is that more dangerous than the there's been some indication of like political extremisms within ufology, white supremacy and so on, but do you see the technological aspect as more of a danger?
I do, and I don't. On the one hand, the reason that technological fascination or fetishism is there is because it's at the heart of our own first world, or what used to be called first world societies. And so what you get is a kind of feedback going on. That's kind of what I see. So in as much as it keeps entrenching this idea that technology is somehow natural, that it advances on its own accord, as opposed to being a function of investment and the vested interests of certain people in society, it just helps cover up the power relations between people, and it sort of freezes up the freedom that we might actually have to begin to imagine and form our future in a different way, rather than always looking for the next update, rather than trying to get the newest phone or what have you. Now, you're quite right to point out that there are extremisms and extremists involved with the UFO ideology, or the UFO mythology, for probably a better word. Timothy McVeigh, for example, he's a good example because he watched the film Contact 6 times before he was executed in jail. And he was also a great fan, an avid listener of the Bill Cooper show. Mm-hmm. And of course, Bill Cooper was, again, a highly reactionary figure, both in American society and in the ufological world. And what's interesting is that you sort of find that the ways that the UFO phenomenon intersects with national security and secrecy in national security helps foster and feed into the sort of more paranoid, libertarian, militia sentiments that are already out there. So again, it's sort of interesting to sort of see the sort of feedback that goes on between certain articulations of the UFO. Sometimes they're outright racist, sometimes they're more anti-government, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, but I find the way that it functions in society to be more of a danger than the militia that it helps inspire, because those militias, they've got other raison d'etre now. They were much more they're much more present in the 90s, I think. And since then, they've kind of moved on to sort of more white nationalist, libertarian ideologies, at least as far as I know.
Do they, you see some overlap between the UFO ideology or religion and these other groups, but is it more incidental because they both speak to a kind of conspiratorial worldview, or is it that one of them, namely well, I guess they both sort of feed into each other, but is it that possibly that there's a kind of post-truth element to them?
Well, that's a very interesting way of putting it. Surely see, again, you put your finger on it when you talk about the conspiratorial element, right? The distrust of government institutions, which of course then feeds into a distrust of the media, especially the United States, right? A lot of this discourse is very much controlled by the American example. A lot of the sort of post-truth criticism of the so-called mainstream media sort of hits home in the United States, where the media is pretty much corporate owned. But you go to other parts of the world and that's not the case, right? In Europe, you've got the Süddeutsche Zeitung. They've got their own problems, for example, but again, they're not quite as invested in as the mainstream media in the United States. So, but I think you make a very good point there. That's a very good observation, that perhaps kind of one of the forerunners of what we see today as post-truth is already there in the distrust of what ufologists, for example, were being told, even from the earliest days. You read Donald Keyhoe, for example, who's writing in the 1950s. He's writing some of the earliest books on flying saucers. And you read what he says there, and he could be describing what a lot of people believe today, that the Air Force knows what they are, The Air Force knows they're extraterrestrial. The Air Force knows whether or not they are a threat, but they're hiding that up. They're covering it up until such time as they feel society is ready for the awful truth, or what today goes by the name of disclosure. And the thing is that, again, you see this sort of stance towards the government. I mean, this goes back deep into at least American history. It's got to do with the way the place is constituted, the conflict between the Federation, the federal government, and the state's government, which we see playing out now, sadly, with abortion. So there's always been this idea of quote unquote freedom, which has become a refrain even here in Canada now, although it's the freedom of a 13-year-old who doesn't quite know what freedom is. There's always been this resistance to authority, this resistance to government, and it just sort of plays itself out under different guises, under different conditions, right up to the present day. And exactly the same way that we see the government, not being totally truthful about UFOs, or at least seeming not to be truthful about UFOs, that's going to secure that sort of suspicion and resentment and, yeah, ill will.
Mm-hmm. And returning to the techno, well, I mean, these actually dovetail because you've talked about the colonialist strains within ufology, or the unconscious colonialist strains. Do you think that there's a kind of reinforcement with a conservative reactionary element there?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I bring up the colonialist dimensions of ufology and SETI in a couple of different ways. Most recently, there was a very good article by actually a journalist who lives here in Montreal. I'd love to run into the guy, that deals with the colonialism of SETI. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, again, Indigenous views are not listened to, that often telescopes and other arrays are put up in sort of more sort of wild, quote unquote, wild places, which are often on Indigenous lands. The most famous example is in Hawaii, where there was a sacred mountain that they wanted to put a telescope on, and that caused a great deal of trouble for months and months and months. But also the idea of how Indigenous peoples look at different life forms. This is, I think, something we might have to touch on, because of course the ufonauts are very much like us, all too much like us. And SETI is looking for us. This is the irony. They're looking for us. When in fact, if you look, and again, you've studied environmental science, and you'll know that in the realm of animal intelligence studies, and even now plant cognition, you can make a strong case for the world actually teeming with intelligent life. But it's so foreign, it's so quote unquote alien, it's so other to what we imagine to be intelligent life, which is just us, that we overlook it and farm it and eat it and cut it down and burn it, which of course runs up against the Indigenous values, which tend to see other living forms as part of a quote unquote community. And that's of course a generalization. You've got to sort of look at each particular society and so on. But also there's this sort of colonialist idea when it comes to colonizing, there's the word, right? Colonizing other planets, looking out into the solar system and beyond as a place for exploration. And the language that is used is always the language, especially in the United States, that's used about exploring and settling the wilds, the quote unquote wilds of North America. And that's deeply problematic. In another vein, however, right, there, and you even find that even early on, I think, even Keyhoe might even make this comparison, that often ufologists will talk about our encountering a quote unquote advanced civilization as being the same as what happened when the indigenous civilizations, whether Aztecs or Iroquois or Britiac or whomever, met Europeans. And they'll always draw the same conclusion, that it ended badly for the indigenous populations. And that itself is a deeply, well, it's a way of thinking that calls for some reflection, at least.
Some people have, such as Curtis Peebles and others, have suggested that in the disclosure narrative, you've got a sort of resuscitation of a Christian eschatology, but that it's repackaged for a secular age. Do you think that's plausible?
That's not implausible. It's an interesting idea. The thing is that the difference I have there is that pre-modern religious intuitions tended to operate within a dualistic cosmos, that there was nature and there was the supernatural. There was nature, especially if we're going to talk about Christianity, there's nature and there's God. And God is outside of space and time. However, especially in the quote unquote Western societies, since the advent of the scientific revolution, the advent of sort of secularism following the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, Darwin, Freud, on and on, that now there's not two realms, there's one realm. There's a purely immanent view of things. And so the idea that there's going to be, so the source of our salvation, if you will, is not going to come from outside nature, outside the cosmos that physics is ultimately capable of understanding and knowing. And that puts a whole different spin on things, right? Because in Christianity and I would imagine the Abrahamic religions in general, God and his messengers, whether Jesus or prophets, I mean, they plug into something outside, and they plug into a design which is outside of the way that nature would otherwise play itself out. So in that regard, I'd sort of have to stop and say, well, wait a minute, that's not going to work. But I mean, I can certainly see this, and there's a good reason to make that argument, or at least to sort of try to trace that down. And that is because of the strong presence and influence of certain kinds of Protestant Christianity in the United States, right? So, and Peebles, being an American writer, would be, you know, that would be sort of woven into his whole way of thinking, even more than he might even know about it. And so there is of course eschatological elements even today. You might remember in the 70s, I think it was, one of the best sellers that came out of the evangelical community in the United States was I think Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth. And this was all about biblical prophecy and how the world was going to end and how Gog and Magog were the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. And those sorts of speculations are still very much there. The evangelical community in the United States was very excited when Trump moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. And the reason for that is they see the state of Israel as playing a very important role in the end time prophecies as they understand them. However, on the third hand, the UFO phenomenon and the UFO mythology is global. There's no doubt about that. And then you've got to start asking, well, is that sort of eschatological scheme present in, say, Latin American countries, which were Catholic? Is it present in sub-Saharan Africa, for example? What about Western Europe? What about the Russian Federation, and so on? And then things get very interesting. I'd be surprised if you could make that argument in a sort of a global or universal way.
And what do you make of the Skinwalker saga?
Well, you know, I got a lot of time on my hands, and like everybody, you know, after 2+ years of pandemic, we're all a little demotivated. So I have been watching the Skinwalker series on the History Channel, and I sort of watch it a little bit. I mean, I just in preparation for today's conversation, I watched a video from the New York Post about AATIP and OSAP, and of course the Skinwalker Ranch plays into that. That seems like a money-making scheme. From what I've seen, people know much more about this than I would, because I don't really pay much attention to that. I don't really see any good evidence of any phenomena which are quote unquote paranormal. What is interesting about Skinwalker Ranch is that the way that it is quote unquote investigated is according to a scheme of thought which is becoming more widely accepted, which is to see UFOs and other paranormal phenomena as part of, I think Vallee called it a unified theory of apparitions. That it's all part and part, it's all one thing. Now, of course, that intuition is already there in Keyhoe back in the 70s. That intuition is articulated by Jacques Vallee, but it's becoming much more prevalent. At least it seems to be that way to me. And a good example would be the talks given at the recent Archives of the Impossible conference at Rice University in Texas. There was Jacques Vallee, Jeffrey Kripal, Whitley Strieber, Diana Pasulka, who I think now goes by the name Heath. I don't know exactly. But everything they said tended to sort of move towards talking about the UFO as an aspect of this broader field of paranormal or psi phenomena.
Yeah.
So that, if the Skinwalker Ranch is at all interesting, it's because it's an instantiation of that way of thinking.
There does seem to be a kind of mode of enchantment, which is gravitating people towards Skinwalker style stories, I think. And I think it could have something to do with how people imagine themselves in the universe. And there could be a evolution of, back in the 90s, it was more about UFOs as mechanical devices, but now there seems to be a kind of supernatural element as well woven in.
Yeah, well, what they do is they couch it in this really poorly reflected talk about quote unquote consciousness.
Yeah, and quantum mysticism.
And quantum mysticism. Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. I mean, what has been, I mean, especially if you read American Cosmic, for example, that comes most quickly to mind. Although it's not an example I like turning to a lot. But what you find there is, again, an emphasis on the way that the UFO or UAP behaves in a non-material way. I think Leslie Kean makes some hay out of this as well somewhere. I seem to recall that, they pop in and out of visibility. They seem to sort of move through different media, whether the oceans or even earth, mountains, the same way that a ghost might walk through walls. They seem immaterial in the way that they move, as if they're free of gravity. They're often associated with different psychic events, which is something that Vallee was, I think, probably one of the first people to really pick up on and plow. The idea that the people who have UFO encounters often have strange poltergeist-like experiences or telepathy or precognitive dreams or out-of-body experiences. And you get this sort of, explored too in Whitley Strieber's books. I haven't read them all. I've read the first 3 or 4. I think I stopped. I didn't read The Key or the ones that came out after that. But you have that there as well. I mean, this is interesting. I don't know why that should be. On the one hand, maybe it's because of the failure to get our hands on a flying saucer, despite all the claims about there being metamaterials and recovered fragments, which is an interesting topic in its own right. But yeah, the fact that they're so elusive, that they slip out of our grasp in the same way that a lot of other psi phenomena do. People like George Hansen will attribute that to a sort of a trickster dimension of the entire field, that the phenomena itself is precisely characterized by this being both and neither, being both apparently material but immaterial at the same time, and so on. But at the same time, you do have, I recall at the end of, I think it's Mirage Men, which is by Pilkington, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It's a really cool story. Again, it's stories, right? But a great story told to the author by a friend of his who was acquaintances with a couple of Air Force men, and they took him out one night to a field. And they said, okay, we're gonna, you really want to know what's going on? He said, yeah, what's going on? And they say, look up. He looks up and he sees the stars. He doesn't see anything. And then, like in a science fiction movie, the cloaking mechanism comes off, and he's like, there's a ship, a vessel floating silently above his head, so close he could reach up and touch it. So here we've got, again, the notion of the technological, right? That we're dealing with something, the physical, although its physics might be not understood or poorly understood by most of us, but there must be some people who've got it figured out. So that's there too, right? So the field is rife with contradictions. This is the other thing. It's contradictory, paradoxical, and it's really hard to make generalizations.
Well, on that,
because it's ongoing, right? It's the story is always unfolding. There's always a next chapter. There's no secret finale.
People making contradictory claims, like you mentioned Mark Pilkington, and
Yes.
I think you're talking about the guy who told him the story about being taken out to the desert and shown the UFO.
Yes.
I think his name was Walter Bosley, and
I'd have to pull the book off my shelf.
I might have the first name wrong, but it's Bosley, and he's a former AATIP agent, Air Force Office of Special.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, but he actually disputes Pilkington's attribution of him to that story.
Okay.
So there's a bit of a spat between them, so I don't know what to make of that particular claim. But anyway, I mean, this adds another element, which is that there's all these claims and counterclaims, and you can't really be sure always who's telling the truth necessarily.
Exactly. I mean, this, you can sort of look at the sort of the Nimitz incidents and the Tic Tac. This is an interesting thing. Again, there's a lot going on there. I'm not as persuaded by it as a lot of people are. And I'm in very close daily correspondence with an acquaintance of mine who's opened up a whole new field. He's working on things in an opposite way from myself. He's very concerned about articulating a way to found or ground an authentic science of the UFO or UAP, and he's pretty persuaded by the Nimitz incidents. But if you think of that Tic Tac. Yeah. What is striking about that is the way that it is reported to have flown to the cap point. We have a naval combat group which is testing out new electronic equipment in terms of electronic countermeasures, radar detection, communication, and so on and so forth. And surprise, surprise, we've got some very strange things going on, and pilots being put through their paces, and this, whatever this is, flying to the cap point. And it would seem to me that this would suggest that what we're dealing with here is a kind of test, that there's some sort of technology. It may be even just a holographic technology, maybe something just kind of illusory, rather than a highly advanced drone, for example. But you find this a lot. You find this a lot, that especially in sort of the different military situations, and Derrida, Jacques Vallee has a lot to say about this. I'm not totally persuaded, but he's got some interesting points to make. That often pilots seem to be put through their paces in a way that would indicate that militaries around the world have taken up the UFO mythology. The fact that half of people believe UFOs are spaceships from outer space, and that's going to therefore include their own personnel, and use it in various ways to test their personnel and test their pilots. I can think of two examples. First of all, there was, what is his name? Damn it. Okay, it's a very common story. There's a low-level intelligence officer, and he's given a document to summarize and report on to a superior officer. This document is a file or a number of files complete with photographs all about crashed and retrieved flying saucers, the aliens that they've retrieved from it, maybe perhaps the deals we've made with the aliens, et cetera, et cetera. And then he goes and so he sees this, the files are taken away, and he's told to report to a superior officer, which he does. Of course, because half of people believe that these things are perfectly true, you're going to have some people in certain positions that are going to believe the same thing. So some of these people will be in the military, they'll be in low-level intelligence positions, and they'll take the bait, and they'll spill the beans, and then they'll wonder why they've been relieved of duty. Well, it must be because of the cover-up. No, it's because we know that half of people believe in flying saucers, and we don't want people like that in higher level intelligence positions. So we test them. And out it comes. And then what's nice is that person goes on the circuit, that person publishes books, keeps the whole myth going, which then can be used for various ways. You think too about the Belgian wave of the sort of in the 1980s with the triangular UFOs. One of the earliest instances, of course, involved a policeman going home to his relatively remote house by a lake. And he sees this large, silent black triangle floating over the lake. Being a policeman, he makes the report. Being that it's Belgium in the 1980s, they scramble the jets. The jets never lay eyes on this object, but they pick it up on radar. On radar, it behaves in ways characteristic of your classical quote-unquote UFO or UAP. It accelerates, it stops on a dime, it makes 45-degree angle turns and so on and so forth, and disappears. Well, the pilots, they land, they make their report, and that's the last they hear of it. What's going on there? Well, I would suggest that what's happening is that NATO or some other agency is testing their radar spoofing technology. And what better way to do that than to simulate the use of it?
Yep.
So again, so this is what's interesting, is that there likely are highly advanced aeroforms or aeroforms which can mimic or otherwise appear as what we understand to be UFOs because they've been designed to do that. I mean, Vallee makes a very good point. In the same way that in the First World War, the Germans would project an image of the Virgin Mary onto a smoke screen in front of the French trenches to kind of freak them out, to confuse them. And so he makes a very good point, Vallee, and this is in his book Revelation. He says, look, imagine that you're an American soldier on a nuclear base somewhere in Europe, and you see a light approaching you, and you hear the sound of a helicopter, and the helicopter comes near, and you see a red star on that helicopter. This was again back in the 80s. What are you going to do? Well, right away, you're going to know exactly what to do. All right, you're going to sort of call your chain of command. You might actually open fire. Who knows? Whatever your standing orders are. On the other hand, you see this light coming at you, and it's silent. And as it gets closer, there's a strange humming sound, and you see a strange saucer shape behind it. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to freeze. You're not going to know what to do. And that, if this is in fact an aeroform which is, designed by human beings, it's being used as a kind of psychological warfare weapon to get the drop on the enemy. Mm-hmm. Right. So again, the technological dimension, that the idea that there are things flying around is not so far from the truth. It's just that they're not from Zeta Reticuli.
Yeah.
And the idea that there are things flying around from Zeta Reticuli is being used by certain agencies in the world to their own ends. That I don't find too far out. I find that believable. I'd have to look into it a lot more to sort of like find evidence, but it's an interesting way of looking at things. And it's funny because it plays into what we were talking about earlier, right? The distrust of government, paranoia, and so on.
Yeah. And on Vallee, who he's made hypotheses about how maybe the Bentwaters UFO was like an advanced drone to test the readiness of the personnel at the base in case,
Yes.
you know, they were testing them to see like how would they respond if the Soviets, you know, snuck in a UFO looking drone to, you know, monitor an ICBM site or something like that.
For example, yeah.
But he's made that sort of hypothesis that maybe the military or the CIA or whoever is running these secret tests. But he also talks about an interdimensional hypothesis.
Yes.
Would you lend any credence to that?
No.
No.
I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I mean, it's based upon such speculative physics.
Yeah.
Because of course, the idea of there being quote unquote other dimensions, as I understand it, or at least as Vallee tries to unpack it, comes out of string theory. Don't ask me how. It also comes out of a certain way that we try to solve certain problems in quantum mechanics, which leads to the many worlds hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all very interesting, but no, that I don't think that gets us very far. You see, Vallee is a very problematic thinker. One could have a whole conversation about that. It's how to put it, because I've been engaging again with some of his writings. But let me just take a step back to the Bentwaters case, because that rang a certain bell. That rang a few bells. First of all, it's a funny. The Bentwaters case is difficult in its own right because it doesn't seem to be any authoritative version of the events. Jenny Randles came out with, I think, 2 books really early on that described it in one way. Vallee seems in the book Revelations seems to depend upon her research to a great deal, but he tells a slightly different story. And there are a lot of other books out there that tell a different story. The way that Vallee puts it, he says that the soldiers were roused out of bed. They were taken to a place in the woods. There were cameras, there were spotlights, there was a fog on the ground. And then this quote unquote drone or whatever shows up, a door opens up, a little fella falls out, a Jeep drives up with some officers, and then the soldiers are told to disperse and not say anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, again, this is interesting. If that is in fact what happened, that doesn't sound like versions I've heard, but if that happens, we can understand why they might do that. Maybe there was some sort of leak on the base. Maybe they had suspicions that someone was too much of a believer. What was it? There were a group of American soldiers who actually left their base in Germany.
Yeah.
They wanted to go to Gulf Breeze, Florida.
The NSA, I think they were NSA employees.
Were they NSA? Because they had received some little.
This was during the Gulf War, I think.
Yeah, they had gotten some information which they took a certain way.
Yeah.
And they interpreted it in this very weird mixture of the ufological and the Christian eschatological, and then they ran with it. So if you've got people like that in the NSA, if you're correct, I mean, it's really important to weed them out, right? And I can imagine if I were high up in CSIS, which is the Canadian intelligence service, I'd be wanting to figure out, okay, how can we weed these people out? Because you want the coldest, most analytical, down to earth people you can possibly have, I would argue. But this segues into another interesting case. I just read in the debrief that, what was it? Was it an aircraft carrier, the Ronald Reagan? And this is very recently. The sailors witnessed this large yellow-orange flaming spheroid hover a few hundred feet over the flight deck. Let's say it was an aircraft carrier, just for the sake of argument. It was silent. it did nothing, and the officers didn't react.
Right.
The officers didn't react. So the sailors didn't do anything. And then after a while, the thing flew off or blinked out or whatever. And if you go to the debrief and look this up, they've interviewed 3 or 4 sailors who say this is what they experienced. Now, let's say that that's the case, that they in fact experienced. What's going on there? It sounds like the same sort of thing that happened, you know, with the Nimitz incident and all the little things flying around. Same thing that happened with Operation Mainbrace. You remember, this goes back, this is one of the earliest instances of, again, a large naval operation with a lot of different little UFO sightings. Early on, as people tried to make sense of the Nimitz encounters and such, the Drive came out with some very interesting hypotheses concerning the way that certain drones and balloons could be used by foreign agents to test the functioning of the newly developed electronic devices on board the ships, which is exactly what you'd want to do. This is why the Russians and other people would like either you fly up to the border of your enemy and see how long it takes them to detect you and to react to you.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of testing is always going on. There's always going on something like that. So again, I think that this is a dimension that is both part of the mythology and keeps the mythology alive. And by mythology, what I mean is all these countless stories, everything from the most feverish, credulous, fantastical imaginations of someone like Mike Sala and the channelers he listens to, all the way to the most serious UFO investigations that we hear about from Jepin in France, for example, including also all the stories, right? The novels, the movies, the television series, the graphic novels, all that is one, for lack of a better word, mythology, one mass of stories which hover or orbit the same sort of idea, right? But in this endlessly multifarious, endlessly new way, and endlessly old way, going over the same thing over and over again. In this, you know, like we see the ideas of Donald Keyhoe coming back again, or people getting all excited about the, you know, American Air Force admitting that UFOs are real. Well, they should be reminded of this thing called the Twining Memo in the 1950s. It was even earlier, I think, where the earliest results of, I think it was Project Sign at the time, was that yes, flying saucers are real. They seem to be mechanical. They seem to be capable of aerodynamics, which is an advance of our own, and we don't know where they come from. But since they're not ours, they're not the Russians, they must be from outer space. 47, I bet, but I'd have to check that up to get my date perfectly right. Yeah.
So this involvement of government agencies or militaries in sort of weaving stories into the mythology or using them to their advantage and stuff like that, electronic warfare, drones and balloons and so on, would you say, is that how your view kind of diverts from the psychosocial hypothesis?
Well, you know, wouldn't that in a sense sort of dovetail nicely into the psychosocial hypothesis?
Right, but I wonder if people who subscribe to the psychosocial hypothesis pay enough attention to these other aspects.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a coherent sort of kind of school, as it were. And I mean, it's out there. I mean, you see the people like Martin Cottermeyer, for example. He's someone who comes to mind. Is it David Clarke, the British folklorist? I think that's his name. He comes to mind. There's a French fellow whose name eludes me right now, who was one of the first to articulate this quote unquote psychosocial hypothesis. But it's not very well cashed out in a way. I mean, someone like Martin Kottmeyer is a very interesting case because he can always come up with, the pulp fiction, the movie, the illustration or whatever, for anything that anyone later would say was a UFO or an abduction experience or whatever. And it's always from the 20s and 30s and 40s and so on. But it would seem to me that, as I understand the psychosocial hypothesis, that if there is this mass of incoherent, because they're not one thing, there's not one unified phenomenon. Rather, there's what's unified is a perception, right? What there is a mass of stimuli, which are then misperceived, misidentified, that are hoaxes or outright or just rumors, just word of mouth, that then are sort of put together and then becomes a sort of a self-sustaining visionary rumor, as I guess Jung would put it. And so wouldn't, therefore, the way that different agencies may have taken this up and used it to their own advantage, wouldn't that fall under like the hoax category? It would seem to me that this fits perfectly into the psychosocial hypothesis.
Right.
But again, I mean, what is there like one book that you know of that sets forth the psychosocial hypothesis in a sort of thoroughgoing, quote unquote, authoritative way?
No, I don't think so. It's more dispersed.
Yeah, it's much more dispersed, which is why it's so hard to get a kind of handle on.
Yeah.
But be that as it may,
Mhm.
it has a lot of explanatory power.
Yes.
One thinks of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction.
Mhm.
It does a really good job with that. It does a really good job with that. And then the insights there can be, expanded.
Do you like David Halperin's take?
David Halperin's take is interesting. I've got his book. I read it with no little pleasure.
Mhm.
I don't buy, okay, how to put it? From a creative point of view, okay, Jung's writings on the UFO and the way that he brings in archetypes and so on is very useful for material. Okay, it's that kind of thing and those kind of patterns that are going to make it into whatever I end up writing, doubtless. But from, do I think of Jung's views as being quote unquote true? No, I do not. I don't buy Jung because I'm much more of a quote unquote structuralist. So for example, Jung talks about the snake as an archetype, but I would say that no, yes, there are snakes in different mythologies all over the world, but the snake plays a different role in all those different societies, and therefore you can't treat it as one thing. In English, we have got the word gift. In German, you've got the same sound, gift. And the meaning is different. Gift is, of course, a present, something you give to someone. In German, the word gift means poison. So the thing is that a sign has a significance only relative to all the other signs in a particular system. And so I don't buy any sort of appeal to quote unquote archetypes. Another problem I have with Halperin's book, and I really should write a review, I mean, just to lay these things out. I mean, he brings in some really great insights into, again, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, especially things about there being a mixed race couple. I don't think he's alone in that, but he makes a lot out of it. And he brings in a lot of very interesting patterns. But there's a blind spot in Halperin, and that is the female experience. So, for example, he tells the story of a parents and a young couple, and the girl is pregnant, and she was made pregnant by accident, which is why now she's a couple with her young man. And they have a UFO experience. Obviously, there's some sort of indeterminate stimuli. The parents and the daughter report one thing, but the boy, the young man, reports this kind of sausage-shaped thing, yeah, which Halperin points out quite persuasively resembles a broken condom.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. But what about the woman? What about the girl? And he never addresses the girl and the stresses she's going under as an unintentional mother, and forced into a marriage, and so on and so forth. And so he's very good, for example, in Betty and Barney Hill, talking about Barney's anxiety as a Black man visiting Quebec City, Montreal. I think they visited Montreal, and being part of a mixed race couple and so on. But he never addresses the anxiety that Betty feels as a woman. Women, as you know, suffer a great deal of violence and sexual violence, and being on guard. Women are as guarded as, you know, any person of color in a situation where that person might be guarded, and he doesn't address this. Right, that's a blind spot in that book. But for the most part, there's a lot of other very interesting stuff. The thing is, what's both good and limited about Halperin's approach is that on the one hand, he's very humble. And so if someone presents him with a case that he cannot explain offhand, he's the first one to say, well, that's a very interesting case. I have a hard time sort of figuring out how I could make sense of it based upon how I look at things. But then, you know, you do have to sort of bite the bullet if you're going to adopt this kind of psychosocial approach. And you do have to sort of approach the cases that do pose a puzzle to you. That's got to be done. And but he's got other interests. He's doing a translation right now. One thing that I'd hoped to learn from Halperin, because he is a scholar of Judaism and specifically of visits to heaven. There's a whole branch of Jewish mysticism called Merkaba mysticism, which comes out of the vision of Ezekiel. And I had hoped that he would have said more informative things about the way that book is written. Because the book of Ezekiel and Ezekiel's vision is notorious in the ufological literature to be always read as if this fella Ezekiel had a real experience that then he described in this book as best he could using the knowledge of the day. And so he has this wild description. And as you know, there was a fellow named Blumrich, who was a NASA engineer. It's a wonderful book, just for sheer intellectual imagination. He reads the book of Ezekiel and tries to imagine this. He designs the spaceship that he believes Ezekiel to be describing. This is wonderful. But the thing is, for me, the book of Ezekiel is a work of prophetic literature. And Ezekiel's vision doesn't even depend upon there being someone, Ezekiel, who actually had a vision or experienced something. Whoever is called Ezekiel had a religious intuition. He had to communicate to the Israelites who were enslaved in Babylon at the time. And he did so using a genre, right, that of prophetic literature. And so whenever in the Old Testament you read the words, "The Lord said to me," at the beginning of a prophetic book, it doesn't mean that someone had an auditory hallucination. It's a way of indicating to the reader that I'm adopting a prophetic role and I've got something prophetic to tell you. And I was kind of hoping he would have gone deeper into the prophetic tradition that led up to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel is kind of the avant-garde writer of his day, because the way that Ezekiel writes is unprecedented. And this is why he's such an interpretive conundrum, even among scholars of Judaism. And he's given rise to so many different interpretations and a whole school of mysticism. So that, I wish he would have gone further with that. And maybe someday I'll be lucky enough to talk with him and we can chew that fat.
Oh yeah, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There is a great book by a fellow called Lieb, I think it is. I'd have to drag it down from my shelf. But what he does is he looks at the figure of the chariot as in ufology, in relation to ufology, as it begins with Ezekiel, and he follows it through its kind of historical incarnations all the way down to the mothership of the Nation of Islam. It's a wonderful, wonderful study. It's just rich. It's highly intellectually nutritious. I can't recommend it high enough.
Yeah, the Nation of Islam, would you call that a UFO religion?
You know, I wouldn't be alone to call it a UFO religion. There's a great scholar whose name, the book's coming out with Duke, and I can see him in my mind's eye, but his name eludes me right now. He's got a book that talks about the Nation of Islam as a quote unquote UFO religion because the mothership plays such an important role in the initiating revelation. I think that's the basic argument. What is this guy's name? It's on the tip of my tongue, but it's 28 degrees in the apartment and my brain isn't working at peak efficiency. I could look him up. Certainly it is the case that among those scholars of religion who look at quote unquote UFO religions, the Nation of Islam is often included, precisely for that reason. And also because when UFOs hit the sort of national consciousness, the Nation of Islam pointed to UFO sightings as proof of their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So it plays a very important role, surely, but it's not a UFO religion in the sense that the Aetherius Society is or was, or that the Raelian Movement International might be said to be. I don't think.
But you also make an interesting point on your blog about the Nation of Islam, which is that to the extent that they adopt the UFO or the mothership, that sort of recapitulates the ideology of the very society that they're trying to emancipate themselves from.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's a kind of a funny argument. I mean, and some people, when that post came out years ago, some people took exception to that. They had a hard time with that. But the point is that if I say I'm as good as you are, well, I'm using you as the value that I'm trying to meet. So you're already better than I am. So that when the Nation of Islam points to the UFO, or better yet, they went by various names, the Nuwaubians. They are a Black supremacist, or they are Black supremacist, or African supremacist, African-centric. I'm not too sure the exact expression. They have a certain view that the white man is a failed experiment, and that the Black man is superior, and that's proven by the fact that they have a superior technology. So the thing is, what they're doing is they're taking, again, what is seen as valuable in the other, and then adopting that for themselves. You could see this in Hindu nationalists as well, who refer to the notion of the Vimana. There's a very famous forgery from the 19th century all about Vimanas, which you'll find without looking too hard, as spaceships. And they say, see, we're as smart as the Westerners. Mm-hmm. We're more technologically advanced. And that's the moment you say we're more technologically advanced, and using technological sophistication as your standard, well, you've already given up, right? Instead of saying we are more civilized, we're more democratic, we had laws long before you did, we had whatever. Yeah, you're just saying I'm as good as you are, but that makes you the standard of what's good, rather than making me the standard of what's good.
And
that was the basic argument.
There was also a Greek
yes,
sort of UFO cult.
Yeah, I hadn't found out about those. I was lucky enough to make the acquaintance of a scholar in Greece. He's mentioned in the blog post, and these people, they're really they're ultra nationalist. They would be called today white supremacists. For them, of course, what they use is the notion of the UFO as a sign that the white race, and not just the white race, but the Greeks, are the master race, as it were, to use an unpleasant expression. Aristotle was an alien, which I guess is why he was so smart. That's what I remember. I'd have to review that blog post to sort of dig up the little details, but it's a fascinating little group I didn't know about. There are all sorts of little groups out there like that. This is the really amazing thing, that even before 1947, the extraterrestrial was already part of what are called new religious movements. You can find accounts from the 1930s in sort of proto-New Age groups of meetings with Venusians and Martians, which are invariably these beautiful blonde-haired enlightened beings. And this amazing variety of small little groups. You think about the phenomenon of channeling, and there was Ashtar Command. I think it's still in existence.
Yeah.
People who are persuaded that the Ashtar Command is going to come and save us because of some terrible cataclysm. There are all sorts of little groups like this, all throughout the world. So there's all sorts of stuff for scholars of religion to focus on and study and write their doctoral dissertations on.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is directly linked to ancient astronauts or ancient aliens ideas.
A lot of it is, yes.
And
yes.
Do you think ancient astronauts, because I think in that very article that you just alluded to, where you talk about the Greek UFO group.
Yes.
I think you were making the point, among other points, but you were making the point that it's not necessarily white nationalists, because there are other groups who also draw succor from that type of narrative. But it just made me think of Savitri Devi, the Indian nationalist Nazi collaborator.
Yeah, you've got me on that. Her book, there's a book about her, which is Hitler's Priestess, I think is the title of the book. That's on my Amazon wish list, but it hasn't made its way onto my my bookshelf yet, sadly. What can you tell me about her?
Well, I was just I recalled what I read about her in a book called The Black Sun by Nicholas Goodrick Clark.
Very famous book.
Yep.
Yes.
I love that book.
That's on my Amazon wish list too. There's a whole aspect of these I've got to get a hold of. Yes, please go on.
It's got a very good chapter on Savitri Devi, and her father, I think, was Greek. Might have been her mother was Greek, and the other parent was English. But she saw herself as part of the so-called Aryan race.
Yes.
She subscribed to Vedic Hinduism.
Yes.
With its castes, and so the upper castes were seen by her and actually many Indian nationalists as Aryans.
Yes.
And that just reminded me that sometimes people outside of Europe can also see themselves as part of the Aryan tradition, so-called.
Well, sure, because of course the thing is, we use the word Aryan today, and most people think of the way that the Nazi Party depicted it as someone who was the blonde-haired and blue-eyed. Of course, what they're doing is they're drawing on a tradition from linguistics.
Yeah.
Right. And the so-called Aryan peoples, and they were Aryan, they're quote-unquote Aryan, they're a real culture. They were patriarchal sun worshippers who had a warrior caste as the top dogs, and they had war chariots, and they moved out of Central Asia, and they moved into Europe. They displaced all sorts of Aboriginal or indigenous people from Europe. They did the same thing in India, so that the people there are indigenous groups in the south of India and in Sri Lanka. And then there are the lighter skinned, they're lighter skinned compared to the people in the south. And they are quote unquote Aryans. Yes. And they brought a certain culture there. And that's why students from India who speak Hindu or Sanskrit, forgive me, have such an easy time learning German.
Yes.
Right? Because the languages are similar. And this is, of course, what freaked out the earliest philologists when they were learning Sanskrit. They go, hell, this is like Latin and Greek. And then, of course, this opens up the whole idea of the Indo-European language groups, which at the time was also spoken about in the same breath as race, which was a new idea in the 18th century. And we're still, of course, working with that inheritance, sadly.
Yeah.
yeah, the earliest talk about race is I mean, the earliest lectures in anthropology are hair-raising by today's standards. And even someone as enlightened, quite literally, as Immanuel Kant, his earliest lectures on anthropology, and he was one of the earliest people to lecture on anthropology in Germany, include 2 or 3 passages about Africans, Black sub-Saharan Africans, which are really mind-boggling.
Yeah.
He did recant those as time went on, but those are the very, very earliest days. And so the thing is that the story of language and linguistics was tied up with those. And, you know, you find a lot, you speak of this particular idea, ancient astronauts, certain kinds of racism and so on, but you find a lot of that in, of course, Madame Blavatsky.
Yes.
And Theosophy. You know, you read the Theosophical tracts as much as you can because they're vast. And I can sort of see how they can be interpreted in a racist way, and I can see how they can be interpreted in a non-racist way. But that's, of course, how they're written too. They're this kind of wishy-washy, new agey way of writing, which evades getting pinned down, because the last thing you want to do is to get pinned down. It's very suggestive in that way. So yes, look, you're right. Different societies, we see it among Hindu nationalists even today, right? I can point you, actually, in that article, there's a link to, actually say in that blog post, there's a link to an article all about the way that Modi's party tried to argue for the superiority of Indian culture because of its ancient technology. Yes. Right. And you have the same thing with the Nubians, except it's more science fictional because, of course, they come from a planet which is more advanced. And I don't know any other groups that do that. You have the Nation of Islam a little bit, the Nubians, the Hindu nationalists.
Maybe some of the other esoteric fascists like Serrano but I think they weren't so much about, well, actually some of them did talk about UFOs a little bit, but they talked more about, you know, like the black sun, whatever that means, like some emanating force pulling out to the white race and stuff like that. It wasn't always about UFOs, but there were some like Antarctic UFO stuff woven in sometimes as well. Like,
well, see, what's interesting about that, and you've written a great article on your own blog about the sort of this chapter, the Nazi UFO, which of course is a complete fabrication.
Yes.
After the fact, used by people like Ernst Zundel, most famously, the Holocaust denier here in Canada, just to get an audience for his distasteful views. It's interesting again in itself, because it is also the case that is it The Flying Saucers Are Real? One of the earliest books, maybe the earliest book by Keyhoe in 1950, where he's imagining what UFOs might be. Even there, he is talking about rumors of advanced aeroforms and the idea or the possibility that some the Russians or the British or the Americans or whomever got a hold of these papers and perhaps the prototypes and developed the quote unquote flying saucers. Of course, I know the truth. And the truth is that it was the Canadians. We got it.
Right.
And that's why the flying saucers that Kenneth Arnold saw were flying from British Columbia. Right. And, you know, the Avro car, well, again, that was our idea, just to sort of cover up the fact that we already had these advanced aeroforms. And we had special insight because of what was something called Project Magnet. This happened in, Project Lure, forgive me. In the 1950s, in an Air Force base in Alberta, the Canadian government tried to signal UFOs using the lights. But what a lot of people don't know is that they were successful. Yes. Okay, so that's my little addition to the mythology there. They're all Canadian, and that's why the UN, they wear blue helmets. Project Blue Book, blue helmets. It's all one and the same thing. New World Order, our idea.
Yeah.
Canada.
Well done.
The Global Village, Marshall McLuhan. Get your Canadian passport soon. Yeah, you see, this is the fun thing about the whole discourse, is that it doesn't take too much to take the themes, take the vectors, take the energies, and kind of run with them in a certain direction.
Yes.
And some people do that for the fun of it. Some people make a lot of money, like Chris Carter. Other people, they buy right into it, like Michael Salla.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, this is what interests me ultimately more than the question of, are UFOs quote unquote real? Is the fact that they are quote unquote real, except they're real as a social phenomenon. And this is what, as an artist, is interesting, is that, more of my students, I make my living as a teacher, more of my students know what a flying saucer is than know who Achilles is or Ulysses, for example. So, what material are you going to use? Here's a ready-made material to talk about everything, to talk about, the environment. That's why I picked it up, because it touches on the environment. As Jung points out, in his hypothesis anyway, his imagining, the flying saucers appear when they do because the world had been split in two by the Cold War, and the circle is a mandala, which is an image of unity. This was, of course, in a nutshell. But also, what happened with the early contactees, right? George Adamski and so on. Well, they were told by the Venusians who landed to stop playing around with nuclear weapons. Bad, you can hurt yourselves. Or better yet, what happens with the abductees? This is of course what got me on the whole thing. Abductees report that often they are shown images of environmental destruction. So right away, see, from my point of view, since most accounts of alien abduction, most but not all, many occur under hypnosis, they're a kind of a dream. And therefore the narratives that arise can be read as a dream, as possessing a manifest content, what in fact they say happened, and a latent content, what it means. And one shouldn't be surprised that at a time when reproductive technologies were really taking off with the Human Genome Project, in vitro fertilization, and so on, that women should begin to have nightmares about being experimented on, right? And at the same time, what sort of things are they shown by the aliens? Environmental destruction. This is 1980s, just when the ecological crisis is really beginning to enter the more general consciousness.
That dovetails into the Ariel incident, doesn't it?
That's it. Yeah, because the children, they reported receiving kind of telepathic messages of that content, if I recall correctly. Yeah, that's funny. This film just came out, and the acquaintance that I'm talking about, I referred to earlier, his name is Mike Sifone, if I pronounce his name correctly, and he has just started a blog and a much larger project. The blog is called Entaus, Entaus, and it's on Blogger, the Google app. And he recently addressed the Ariel event. He seems, I'd have to read it again because he writes very long and very, very philosophical posts. They're even more gritty than mine. He seems to take it at face value. He seems to believe that it was a real event. And he seems to believe that the students, in fact, saw something anomalous, and it involves seeing entities. And part of that proof is the consistency of their stories from the time up until now as adults, as evidenced by the interviews in the film. to my knowledge, the case is much more complex and dubitable than that. But for what it's worth, I mean, see, this is the other interesting thing, is that I know that you are not persuaded that there's any hard evidence out there at all. That's my understanding.
For any otherworldly explanation.
See, okay, there's the hypothesis, right? And so you reject, for example, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the interdimensional hypothesis, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, I imagine, things along this line. But I'm talking more about just sheer anomalous events.
You mean like?
You see, it's easy to sort of say, oh yes, extraterrestrial hypothesis, that's just silly. There's good reason not to believe that, and even Vallee has come up with that. But I think what's interesting is, I mean, I've been reading about this stuff. I've read a lot about it as a boy, of course, and I put it away for a long time. And then back in the 94, I started reading it again. So I've been reading it all since 1994 again. And you know, one goes through different phases. If I'm pushed, I tend to adopt a more psychosocial position. But I'm also aware that there seem to be some cases out there which are just plain weird, and they're really hard to explain away. I don't know what they are. I don't pretend to know what they are. I don't pretend to see them as evidence of anything, but I will argue that, you know, there do seem to be some anomalous events.
Like the apparition at Fatima.
Oh, that's a wonderful story, eh? That's a wonderful story. I love that. That's going in the book. That's going into the epic poem for sure. It has to. It has to. Especially for someone raised Catholic like me. Yeah. Are we assuming that our listeners all know the Fatima event?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Do you want to give the lowdown, or shall I give the lowdown?
You please.
Okay. And of course, I trust you'll pipe in when I pass over something. Look, basically, of course, the Fatima event is one of the most famous visions, so-called, of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is a whole class of anomalous events in themselves, right? There's BVM, the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's like poltergeist events. There's a whole raft of those. But anyway, this happens in Portugal in 1917. There's kind of an official version and then a more detailed version. But in a nutshell, there are 3 young shepherds, 2 shepherdesses and a shepherd, two young girls and a boy. And there's a strange little light and a buzzing sound, and this little light descends on top of a tree, and they see a little figure in the tree, and they're not too sure who it is, but it tells them to pray, and they pray. It tells them to come back, and they tell some people, and they come back, and some people come with them. And this goes on for a little while. No one can ever see who it is. No one can hear the voice. But this goes on until such a time as word really gets out. And what was it at the final event? There was, I think, 50,000 people.
Arguably, something like that, yeah.
It was some amazing amount of people. And then things really got interesting because there was the miracle of the sun. And again, I'm probably going to not describe this in perfectly accurate terms, but it involved the sun, first of all, appearing as a spinning silver disc that then descended in a falling leaf motion. There was a technicolor, the colors flying all over the place. The people witnessed. There was a rainstorm that soaked people, but then a heat from this apparition that dried them all off. And of course, what I've just described is very similar to what later on would be described as a UFO event, especially the falling leaf motion, the spinning disc, the colors. And I think there was even some angel hair involved. There was what was described as rose petals falling from the sky that quite paradoxically didn't become larger as they got closer, but became smaller as they got closer and disappeared just before they reached the outstretched fingers of the people trying to catch them. So the Catholic Church investigated this. I don't know what their final verdict was. I think they accepted it as an authentic vision of the Virgin. And as well, there were 3 secrets given to the children, which were then communicated to the church in secret. And I think they've all been opened now. but we don't know what they are, because I think that one of them had to do with was actually Pope Francis blessing Russia just recently.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound? I mean, that's not perfectly accurate, but
Yeah,
that
yeah.
will give people an outline. How's that?
Yes, perfect.
You probably know there's a 4-volume study available from Anomalous books that looks much more closely at what the children actually described, and it's really wonderful because the figure in the light that descends on the tree before which they kneel to pray is actually described as a diminutive woman, not quite 5 feet tall, and she's wearing basically a miniskirt. It's really quite marvelous. It's a marvelous story, and again, controversial. I like the story. That seems to be an anomalous event, but I know that there are also skeptical and debunking accounts which do their damnedest to dissolve its believability.
But do you think, is it the sheer number of people who saw it that makes it compelling for you? Because couldn't you just invoke the psychosocial hypothesis and say something like that it was a mass hysteria or some sort of...
Well, mass hysteria, I mean, can you give me an example of mass hysteria that would result in such homogeneous hallucinations?
What about the airship stories in the early 20th century?
Now that's very interesting. One starts to read those and one thinks, oh, those sound like prototypical UFO encounters. But the more one looks into it, I would bet my bottom dollar that they were all newspaper hoaxes. That there are all stories, which is beautiful. It's just beautiful in itself. I mean, we talk about evidence for the psychosocial hypothesis. In the 19th century, there was a great deal of yellow journalism. For a long time, I was of the opinion that it had something to do with the looming Spanish-American War, because of course the airships were seen in 1896, 1897, and there are a number of stories. I have published a book on this. There's a book of poetry out there all about that, summing it all up, and there's all sorts of wonderful accounts. And the interesting ones are the landings and the ones where they talk to the pilots. And sometimes the pilots seem foreign, and sometimes the pilots are good Americans. And so it occurred to me that, wouldn't it make sense? I mean, especially the fact that Hearst was I'm pretty sure he was the owner of a lot of the newspapers. I have to look into this. Who owned the newspapers that published these stories? Mm-hmm. And at one time I imagined, wouldn't it make sense that you've got this war looming up, and how can we get the populace on side? What if we persuaded people that there were these airships, these dirigibles? And there are two possibilities. Either they're not ours, in which case the populace is afraid, in which case they rush into the arms of the government for security. What if they're ours? Well, then that's proof of Yankee ingenuity, and it increases the morale of the populace when we go to war with Spain.
Mm-hmm.
You see? So again, regardless of whether that was the case or not, the fact that we can think that way points again to the not so much the fact that these stories arise out of, certain beliefs or what have you, or misidentifications and so on, but that they have a social function.
Yeah.
This is the thing, is that this is a mythology that has a role to play, and it plays a role in how we think of ourselves, how we think of our futures, how we don't think of our futures, and so on. Mm-hmm. It's this weird proto-religion. And what I mean by that is that I think it's even Jung who says this, but I might be mistaken on that the beauty of the UFO mythology, as I've been calling it, is that perhaps here we have the opportunity to see a religion in the process of becoming.
Yeah.
We don't get a chance to see that a lot. Right? We can imagine, and Diana Pasulka is of this opinion, that we are seeing a kind of religion. a kind of belief, and it is very, very interesting how it functions, because it functions sub rosa. There are people unlike early Christianity, which was the religion of slaves and the bored wives of the patricians, and some of the legionnaires. This cuts across all strata. And this is ironically the point of Diana Pasulka's first book, American Cosmic, that there's a group of people, tech bros, let's call them tech bros, who believe in these things in certain ways and believe that they get their insights by tapping into these extraterrestrial sources by various means. Mm-hmm. That's at least how she tells us. That's at least what she tells us at the Rice University conference. So if we have people all the way from someone like Deep Prasad, who's an entrepreneur, and we've got people in the American government, right? If we want to talk about AATIP and OSAP and so on, who believe these things, and then all the way down to the poor country folk who were attacked by goblins in Hopkinsville, right? So there's a lot of interesting sociological mechanisms going on, and the way that the different ways that this belief functions in society. This, I think, is far more important than, are we being visited by creatures from outer space, which I really don't think is happening at all. That's the very last thing that's going on, and I'm hardly alone in that opinion. So, even among people interested in the field, Yeah.
But I mean, you mentioned the genuine anomalies as you see them.
Yes.
Like the Fatima apparition. Like, what do you think? What do you think that if it wasn't some strange atmospheric phenomenon? I mean, do you think it could have been that, or would you ascribe a more esoteric explanation to it? If it's something beyond social.
Well, you see, this is where I stop. I don't. I mean, as tempting as it is to try to explain, to identify the unidentified, to smooth out the anomalous, I'm just going to stop and say, isn't that interesting? Isn't that provocative? And let it sit and suggest its various interpretations. That feeds the imagination, and that feeds the intellect a lot more than trying to close it down. It depends what's at stake too, It's funny. I just got out of collaborating with a paper with my collaborator, precisely around the question of witness testimony, which of course segues into the Fatima event. I don't know, because again, there's the field, the psychological field is a large one. And I don't know of any sort of account of mass hysteria that could, any theory of mass hysteria or any observations of mass hysteria that can account for such a uniform observation. I mean, look, for example, Jacques Vallee, in, I think it's the first book, Anatomy of a Phenomenon, relates this one UFO event from France. And, the events in France, especially the waves of 54 and 57, are very, very interesting. And I don't know what psychosocial explanations have been proposed for a number of them. But there's one that sticks with me. I think it's a farmer. I think he's a farmer, and his farm is near a railroad.
Yeah.
And he's out working in his barn, and this flash of light catches his eye. And he looks towards the flash of light, and it looks like someone's arc welding. And he walks towards the light because he's curious, because it's like 2 a.m. What the hell are they doing arc welding at this time of night? And he sees this thing that looks like a gas tank, like a big propane tank. And a man or what seems to be a man in, I think, dark overalls standing beside it, who climbs inside this thing, and it flies off silently into the night. And well, that's interesting. So he doesn't know what's going on. He calls the authorities, who show up, and they find that the railway ties have these depressions in them. And they calculate that it would require like some enormous mass to leave these impressions in the railway ties where the man claims to have seen this thing. Okay, what's going on there? I don't know. We've got some puzzling traces that offhand can't be accounted for. We have a strange observation which lacks rhyme or reason, and it just kind of sticks in the throat of the mind as something. Well, that's interesting. What the hell was that? Who knows? I mean, as well, you can think to the what was it? The first event where angel hair was described throughout a part of France. Right, there were these spindle-like objects, vertical, seen high in the sky, floating along silently and slowly, with smoke emitted from one end and little discs coming from the other, and then this descent of "quote unquote" angel hair, which disappears. So it's not spider webs. I mean, they've attempted to describe it in terms of different kinds of insects, gossamer and so on, but this doesn't seem to fit the description, especially given that there was a chemistry professor at the local école who took some of the stuff and put it in a little vial, and it evaporated later. So there's not even a question of mass hysteria there, because unlike the Fatima event, where you can say, okay, people are primed to believe, and so on and so forth, it's like a sporting event or what have you, okay, but this is not like that at all. This is just some weird observation with weird traces. What do you do with that? I don't know. Well, it's not interesting. And you kind of have to leave it at that. It seems to me, rather than like some skeptics or debunkers who will immediately dogmatically, right, dismiss it and not even offer a very good explanation. And this is why I avoid the whole question of the "quote unquote" reality, because it's out of my wheelhouse. There's just like if you're going to really dig into it and dig into certain cases, there's a lot of research to do, and then just the know-how, just like the forensic complications and questions of physics and chemistry and things like that. That's I mean, I'm only one man. I've got a certain education, and I work within what I can make of things. I leave the question of the reality up to my acquaintance Mike Zifone over at the Enteas blog.
Mm-hmm.
But what about you? Are there no, because I know that you reject certain hypotheses, but what about the sheer anomalies? Or do you think there are any anomalies?
I think there are currently unexplained cases.
Yeah.
The mundane explanations are not necessarily super good fits.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that there are in principle no mundane explanations that could fit the case if we had more data.
Yeah, that's always the argument, isn't it? That, well, if we had enough data, we would come to an explanation. Yeah, that's always a safe position to take. And I'm not criticizing it, right? I'm just saying I appreciate it. I surely do. But also the thing is that, just to play devil's advocate, there's a sense, well, you're sort of pulling back from what might be, at the very least, and this is an old argument. This goes back to Vallee's earliest books and others. They said, well, look, if we can't explain some of these anomalous phenomena, we're not saying they're necessarily Venusians or Martians or Zeta Reticulans or whatever, but maybe it's just some strange natural phenomenon that we don't understand. And that should incite our scientific interest anyway. And you see someone like the late Michael Persinger, right, sort of try to approach things that way, in a very interesting way. And I think that wasn't the case that some files from the Ministry of Defense in England came out where they proposed, I think David Clark tells us this, where they proposed that most UAPs are a kind of poorly understood plasma phenomenon. I'm not sure whether it's one or many. Let's say it's one plasma phenomenon that can affect the human nervous system, in particular the temporal lobe, in ways that are not poorly understood, resulting in hearing paralysis, hearing voices, having effects like sunburn, and so on and so forth. And the researcher Michael Budden tried to pursue this back in the 80s in a very interesting way, if not ultimately a very solid way, along the lines of looking at electromagnetic pollution and plasma phenomena and so on and so forth. One can even say, so well, maybe some of these anomalous events point to a poorly understood natural phenomenon that should call for our interest.
Yep. I think the Hesdalen lights
yes,
for an example.
Yes, they're funny. There was one book in English, Operation Identification, and it was like a serious UFO investigation. There was a little wave or a little hot spot, and I think the author is a physicist. I think, again, I'd have to drag the book off my bookshelf. It's just behind me, but he went out with his grad students, and they set up cameras and telescopes, and they made observations and this and that. And what's interesting is a lot of the phenomena that they captured on camera look a lot like the Hesdalen lights, which don't resemble kind of standard orbs or spheres, but more sort of weird fluid plasmid things. Right? They don't seem to have a particular shape. They're much more kind of elongated often and squiggly, and at least from the pictures I've seen.
Yeah. There have been some scientific papers which have been put out about, measuring equipment, what it's picked up and stuff like that.
Yes.
But I mean, Skinwalker, not so much. Like they make this thing that they've got all this equipment and stuff, and they do this reality TV show.
Yes.
And they hype it up, but they never seem to release the data, even
No.
though they keep promising they're going to.
No, it's terrible. Now, on the other hand, I mean, it is terrible to watch because it's such a howler. If for anyone who knows anything about scientific method, it's a total howler. But I mean, there's this new again. It's funny how the research is carried out in reality TV and documentaries. Yeah. But there is this new show coming out. I think it's a documentary called A Tear in the Sky, and it's hosted or narrated by William Shatner. Yeah. But one of the physicists involved is Knut, and there's actually a paper that's being published in the organ of the SCU. Is that it? The Society. Scientific, is it the SCU? What is it? But it is a group of mainly academics and other people who are trying to look at UAP from a strictly measurable perspective. Knut, this is one of the Knut and some collaborators also did a paper on the flight characteristics of the Tic Tac, the JAL event, where there was a Japanese airliner that near Alaska, whose pilots claimed to have seen this enormous flying saucer out their window, I think it was. And then a more famous case from the 1950s of a military craft flying over the Atlantic that reported a disc-shaped object in pursuit. And they go through a lot of physics, and they imagine, okay, well, if these observations are the case, then this is what's going on. And if it descends from this altitude to that altitude in this period of time, then these are the G forces involved, and this is the energy requirements, and so on and so forth. So, even though the Skinwalker Ranch is of course, a money-making venture, There are people trying anyway, their damnedest to quantify at least observations. But as I've pointed out to my friend Mike Sifone, a lot of the problem is that well, are these observations even as unquestionable as we need them to be in the first place?
Yeah.
But this is the real problem. Okay, let's get. Can we agree on a data set from some event? And that's really hard to do. That's I'm unaware of any event that most people are completely in agreement on, where we can have some hard data and instrumental data. That's the thing. In the paper that I'm not writing about witness testimony, I make the passing observation that if it's the case that the ufologist doesn't cite the UFO but the witness report, then the witness becomes by default a kind of instrument, right? Where there's not a camera, where there's not radar, where there's not some other piece of equipment, the witness is an instrument, and they register data, visual, sensory, olfactory, auditory, or whatever. But they're getting, anyway, this is the problem, right? Hard data. Give me the data, show me the data. And then where did we get that data? And this is the problem, right? The more you look into, well, where'd you get that data from? The more things begin to dissolve. I mean, you think, these videos that were all released back in 2017 of the Go Fast, the Gimbal, and the Flare, if I've got those three names more or less right. These are, of course, highly questionable because the provenance is unclear. There's metadata missing from them. And they're all released within the context of this Elizondo affair, which makes them seem like just akin to the Scully affair, the guy who gave us the story of crash flying saucers back in the 1950s. But it's a famous case.
Yeah.
It's a famous case. And of course, the Roswell case wasn't even a Roswell case until the 1970s.
Yeah.
Right? So, so anyway, all I want to say is that a lot of that stuff that comes out in 2017 with Elizondo and company, it seems like a scam.
Mm-hmm.
And given that they created this little corporation and they tried to raise money, and they're still trying to raise money. I mean, now he's got this this website. What is it? It's a silly name. Phenomenon, like this database that he wants to sell subscriptions to. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of that? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. This does not bode well. This does not inspire confidence. This is, in a very serious sense, not serious.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be a quote unquote scientific ufologist, man, you got a steep, high hill to climb to get that data and then to get it taken seriously. And not that it shouldn't be if you can get it. Mm-hmm. But again, that's out of my wheelhouse, and that's ultimately not what's as interesting.
Yeah.
To me. You see, it's funny that's what's at stake for so many people. Even the fact that that's what's at stake. You've got the believer and the skeptic / debunker. And then the vast majority of people, half of the population of the United States for the longest time believes that flying saucers are real and they come from outer space. Mm-hmm. Now that's not necessarily a belief that they will set that, it's not a life and death belief, but it's a belief and it's there. You ask them, that's what they'll say. Yeah. That's interesting in itself. Mm-hmm. Apart from whatever's going on, apart from whatever ultimately is the stimulus behind the reports.
Yes. And by the way, I remembered the Scully case,
yes.
The Aztec case.
Aztec case. Behind the Flying Saucers is the title. The Aztec case, yes.
He was the one, him or his associate were involved in some sort of oil finding machine scam, right?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
And that reminds me a bit of Hal Puthoff and like his claims about like his association with something called the Sapphire Project,
Yeah.
various psychic stuff back in the 70s with SRI.
Yes. The he was it's remote viewing, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. He was
Yeah.
promoting Uri Geller back in the day,
Was that Hal Puthoff?
and Jacques Vallee.
Well, Jacques Vallee. There was another person who was who very early, was it Puthoff?
Puharich, maybe.
Puharich. Yes, thank you. It was Puharich who was in with Uri Geller.
Mhm.
And but see, that's the funny thing. You read Jacques Vallee, and it's this very odd mix of skepticism and credulity.
Yeah.
Because most people will dismiss Uri Geller as a fraud, but Jacques Vallee will accept certain things that happened as real. And of course, Hansen would say, well, this mixture of fraud and reality is precisely a mark of the liminality of the phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right. So it's there was another example from Vallee, which is a good one too, which is this mix of oh yeah, because this is someone you know very well. It's Bob Lazar.
Yep.
Right. And I know you've dug into Lazar very deeply, and he is, I think, is, correct me if I'm mistaken, but as far as you're concerned, he's a con man.
Yes.
Yeah. So Vallee is persuaded that that a lot of the things that you would say that Lazar says are false, Vallee would agree are false, at least in the book Revelations. But he also believes that, or he seems to believe that some other things that he says are true, that he was in fact taken to this laboratory, and he was in fact given this object to study and reverse engineer. And it was the fact that they tried to open it with a chainsaw, etc. Okay, and so it's a strange take on the story. Well, because I would tend to agree more with you. He's just a scam artist. Because how do you square the fact that okay, maybe he was just duped for some reason, who knows why, to start certain stories or something, and then turned it to his own advantage. I don't know, but there's a very strange and oddly frustrating thing about Vallee, is this mixture of kind of like inquisitive skepticism but then credulity when it comes to certain things. And then of course this just, I'm sad to say, this just gets worse with his latest two books, right? Wonders in the Sky and then Trinity.
Right. And what do you think explains that trajectory in his, because before, like for decades, he's been saying that the crash narrative is like counterproductive and that it's a distraction, but now he's basically regurgitating it.
Yes. This I cannot explain. I mean, I do my best. Anyone who dares visit Skunkworks blog will find 2 or 3 pieces on Trinity. One is a quote unquote review, which is a very honest review, but I would argue it's respectful, however critical it is. And it is a terrible, terrible work. As a book that tries to make a case, it is just awful. It's a failure. And so, but I do try in a later post to try to recover something from it, because Vallee makes some strange claims, and it's almost as if he understands that the story isn't true, but it has a symbolic truth, but he can't prise himself away from the idea that words must refer to the world, that he's talking about facts. So he picks up on at one point, there's a lot of numerological or numerical patterns at work in this story. There were at the Trinity site, which is named after 3 mountain peaks in the background, there were 3 atom bomb tests. And the thing that supposedly crashed, there are 3 creatures that got out of it. And one can multiply these patterns as well. And on the one hand, one can see Vallee's background as an information scientist, because that's where he makes his bucks, right? as what they say in French, informatique, right? Information sciences. I don't think cybernetics might have been the old word. You can see him looking for patterns. You can see looking for patterns, but he can't quite admit that the pattern becomes merely kind of literary or mythological or symbolic rather than a real pattern, like the fact that every time you check the atomic weight of an atom of hydrogen, it's the same. He can't distinguish these patterns. And so what I try to do in one of my posts is I try to salvage the mythological, symbolic significance of this story, despite Vallee's and Paola Harris's insistence on its factual truth.
Yes.
But how to account for this? What one sees is that when he collaborates, things go downhill, sadly. And this is not to badmouth Chris Aubeck, who's a nice fellow, and he's written a couple books and things. I have nothing against him. But the book Wonders in the Sky, a lot of howlers in there, and Martin Kottmeyer catalogs them all. And then Trinity, just an awful, awful book. It's just tragic. And this all happens after the trilogy, right? I've been sort of rereading Vallee again, and if I have the time and the wherewithal, I'm going to sort of review each of the books from the very first books up to the last ones. And my take on Vallee has changed now. A lot of people see an important break with Passport to Magonia. I would argue that the first three books, Anatomy of a Phenomenon, Challenge to Science, and Passport to Magonia, are sort of one phase, because there he's looking at the object. Now, in Passport to Magonia, that object kind of expands historically, but he's still looking at the thing, the object. With the next two books, Invisible College and Messengers of Deception, he explicitly turns his attention to the subject, to the witness, to the sociological effects.
Yep. There's
the hinge. And then that opens up the possibility for the three books that everyone should have on their bookshelf. Dimensions, which, as far as I can tell, is pretty much a revision of Passport to Magonia. Confrontations, which is probably his most solid, quote unquote, scientific work, right? Because he looks at a lot of very interesting cases and with a lot of solid data, relatively solid data. And then Revelations, where he reflects on, the sort of the stuff that I've been talking about here, about the way that the military and other groups might be using the UFO mythology to their own ends, whatever those might be. And then after that, after the trilogy, then things take a strange turn with Wonders in the Sky and Trinity. That would be that'd be how I see Vallee's vector. And so what happens between Revelations and everything, I don't know. There's one paper he does with Eric Davis, which he published in a referee journal, which is not a bad piece of work, but that's a fairly solid piece of work. And I guess that's kind of a counterexample because he's collaborating with someone and it's not a disaster. But then, on the other hand, he gave a very interesting talk. I'm not persuaded by it, but an interesting talk and a coherent talk and a relatively cogent talk at the Rice University conference. He gave the keynote address. And people can read my review of that at Skunkworks blog as well. And that's much more cogent than either of the two latest books. And he makes some very good points there. He actually makes a very good point regarding abductions of all things, which I don't, again, not to offend any listeners who might be experiencers. I have a hard time swallowing that whole narrative, the whole narrative, let's put it that way, especially the one that was promulgated by Hopkins and Jacobs. Okay, there's a whole sort of edifice there about breeding programs and so on and so forth. But Vallee makes a very interesting little argument. He says, just as no one's being abducted and interbred with aliens, there's no such thing as unicorns. And then he points to a picture of a unicorn. And what he's pointing to is a picture of a goat that a friend of his in California had surgically altered so that the horns, as a little baby goat, you can surgically alter the little horn buds so they grow together and grow into one horn.
Mm-hmm.
So the point he's making is that there's no such thing as unicorns, but there are such things as unicorns, right? But don't think of them as, you know, a creature like a rhinoceros or a narwhal or whatever, but there are unicorns. So it doesn't follow from that just because something is physically impossible, like interbreeding human beings and aliens, unless you buy that we are aliens, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we know the circularity of that account. Maybe something else is going on. Maybe the story is significant in another way. And this is where he gets onto something. But he doesn't quite know what to make of it himself. And that's what's so frustrating. And that is, you know, this notion of metalogic that he brings up in Invisible College. Mm-hmm. As an information scientist, I understand what he means by metalogic. He's just referring to a meta language. So that grammar, in a sense, is a meta language. The language of linguistics is a meta language because you've got the real phenomenon of spoken languages, but you need a language to talk about that language. That language is called a meta language. And so for Vallee, he makes a very good, it's a provocative idea, let's put it that way, that the UFO event is not what it seems, right? Roland Barthes uses a wonderful example from a grammar book. And he says, okay, here I am, I'm a student in the lycée and I'm learning Latin. And I read a story that says, Leo is a lion. Now the meaning of the sentence is not about lions or their names, but rather about function of parts of speech and how the number of the verb must harmonize with the number of the subject of that verb. In other words, you conjugate a verb in the singular with a singular subject, right? So the meaning is not what it says. It's an example of something. And this, as I take it, is Vallee's point, that the UFO event, for all of its absurdity, right? What seems to be a spaceship lands and little diminutive guys get out in what appear to be spacesuits, and they seem to take samples of rocks and plants and get back in and fly off. Well, that's like Leo is a lion, right? A spaceship landed and the astronauts got out and took some samples. But that's not what it means. It's an example of, it's working not quote unquote logically, but metalogically. You've got to adopt a meta-analysis. But the trouble is we lack the linguistic structure, right, to understand the meaning of that. And in a way, maybe that's kind of what my project is at heart, is getting at the meaning, right? That these things are not, you don't take these things at face value. And if I wanted to sort of be a more strict ufologist, I would say, well, maybe what we need to do is adopt the methods of semiotics, which linguists do, and maybe we could develop a semiotics of the UFO event, and we might find something. We might find some patterns, the way that Levi-Strauss was able to study look, this was the problem Levi-Strauss faced. There he was, the anthropologist in South America, and he was faced with literally thousands on thousands and thousands of myths. Now, if he was going to do what the literary scholar at the time would do, sit down and interpret each myth, he would never get anywhere. And nor would it even be quote unquote scientific, because it's purely empirical. You would never reach a point where you could make generalizations. Luckily, he ran into Roman Jakobson in New York when they were both in exile from the war. Roman Jakobson was, of course, a very, very famous linguist, and he told Levi-Strauss about structuralist linguistics. Because as a linguist, you're able to deduce, or actually the word is abduct, interestingly enough, the rules of a language without having to analyze every single possible sentence in the language. So in the same way, Levi-Strauss thought, well, I don't have to analyze every single myth. I don't have to understand every single myth the way the linguist doesn't have to understand every single sentence in a language. They have methods to arrive at the laws which govern that language. And so he ran with this idea and came up with a brain-cracking 4-volume study called Metalogic, Mythologies. And, you know, if I really were in charge of a research facility here in Montreal, I would assign a little team to develop a semiotics of the UAP event, of the UAP observation. And that would, who knows what that would lead to.
Mm-hmm. So Vallee is maybe making it too literal in a way.
Well, you see, I think it's so hard because I think he knows that it's not literal, but he can't admit that it's literal. There's a repression going on. And my guess, and I may just write this at a certain point, is that you can look at everything from anatomy of a phenomenon all the way to Trinity and see this tension between his doing a kind of folklore, looking at patterns in narratives, and at this, but taking it as a kind of scientific study. So from the beginning, right, you read the preface to Anatomy of a Phenomenon, he says, hey, the object of study is not the UFO itself, but the witness report. Well, the witness report is a narrative. It's a genre. It's a work it's a linguistic artifact. But of course, for him, what's important is what it refers to. But even there, you follow him, you get to challenge the science, and that relation between the linguistic artifact and what it supposedly refers to loosens up until you get to Passport to Magonia, where you read the appendix, where he actually says, warning, these cases that I've collected here shouldn't necessarily be taken as being true. Mm-hmm. So what's going on there? So what he's doing is he's doing a kind of folklore. But at the same time, he writes as if he's not doing a folklore. Mm-hmm. Right? He says on the one hand, well, you can't believe all these stories. On the other hand, but these stories all have these patterns, and therefore, the UFO is like fairy abductions, is like, et cetera, et cetera. This is the thesis of Passport to Magonia, that, well, these events are the same events that have always been occurring.
Yes.
It's in different guises, whether they be demons or jinn or fairies or dwarves or kobolds or what have you. But that I find absolutely unpersuasive. It's imaginatively rich, but intellectually unpersuasive, because it's absolutely ahistorical, and it absolutely ignores how narratives in fact work, how they are produced and how they are received, both at the moment of their production and reception and over time. This is a profound blindness. And what really irritates me and mystifies me is that even with the religious studies scholars that he hangs with, Diana Pasulka and or Heath and Jeffrey Kripal, who should know better, mm-hmm. They never call him on this. They never say, well, Jacques, in the 13th century, if you write about something that shows up that looks like an eye and it strikes you with these lights and you raise your finger 3 times, et cetera, well, these are ways of writing things. These are not, you can't take these as like a newspaper account. Yeah. While in the same breath, and you've got to, give this to Diane Pasulka, she points out that, very famous Teresa of Avila has a very interesting encounter, and that if you actually go to her diaries and read what she writes in the Latin, it sounds very much like a contemporary entity encounter. It's striking in how down to earth it is, and how much Teresa of Avila actually insists that no, this is not a vision. This was like a real little man who showed up in my cell. It's very interesting. But the thing is, you've always got to take into account the quote unquote rhetoric, the ways that people spoke and communicated, right? Anyone who believes that the Israelites were in the desert for 40 years can't read the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? Because that they were there for 40 years. I mean, there's a famous joke on the internet oh, well, Moses took 40 years to wander from Egypt to Israel. And then they show a little Google map that, okay, it only takes, so long to walk there. But they were there for 40 years, and for 40 years, because 40 is a symbolic number.
Yes.
That's why, right? And you've got to understand these, what literature scholars and others call a code. It's just how these things are written, how these things are understood. And if you don't understand that, you're going to misinterpret them. And there's a lot of misinterpretation that goes on the moment we move out from the so-called modern era. Right.
Pasulka talks about like the realist montage in her book. And do you think maybe Vallee is inadvertently doing a version of that on himself?
Remind me of the realist montage. That
she was talking about the ways that media has evolved in the age of digital technology, and how you can, stitch together documentaries which are sort of in the reality TV type of mode, where you sort of or like you can make movies like like the Blair Witch Project and stuff like that. They're sort of made to look real, but then apparently studies have found that people, they're not able to distinguish reality from fiction in many cases, and then they start to believe whatever is in these stories, and then they kind of spread. That
was a part of her book I wanted to reread and think a bit more about. I mean, that segues into a couple of different things. First of all, there's Baudrillard's notion of hyperreality. And by that, what he means is that the real thing is confirmed as real by its representation. And what I mean is a great example from a novel by Don DeLillo, Libra, which is about the Kennedy assassination. And there's a scene where Kennedy is getting off an airplane to an adoring crowd. And one of the people in the crowd says, oh, he looks just like his pictures, right? So the representation is used to legitimate the authenticity of the real thing, right? As opposed to the other way around, where the picture should look just like the person. So you get your portrait painted, and that portrait should look like you. But in hyperreality, which is where we live in an age of heightened media reproduction, the thing is confirmed by its representation. And so the thing is, in a way, this dovetails quite nicely into the Pasulka's insight, and that is that you see something in the sky, and oh, that's a flying saucer. Why? Because it looks just like the flying saucers that I've seen in the movies, in the magazines, in the books, in whatever, right? The representation precedes and again, this segues into the psychosocial hypothesis. So I don't think that's happening with Vallee, though. I don't think so. Because that is a function of a certain media environment, which is much more contemporary, and is only coming onto the scene when Vallee is coming onto the scene. I mean, how many mockumentaries were there on French TV in the 60s?
I wouldn't know.
You see, this is the thing, right? Is that for this effect to occur, you have to have this leaking of fictional content into factual forms of representation, if you will, right? And of course, this begins to get theorized around the time that Vallee begins to publish with Marshall McLuhan, right? So there might be a case to be made, but that would require a lot more reading and research on my part anyway. I don't see that quite as the same thing in this case. I really don't know. I'm quite puzzled. And at the end of the day now, I still value Vallee's books. I put out for that 50th anniversary edition, signed 50th anniversary edition of Passport to Magonia that the Daily Grail Press came out with. I have the third of 300 copies signed by Jacques Vallee. So, he holds an honored place on my bookshelf. That's for sure. And I will certainly write more about him, and I will certainly draw on his work a lot. But when it comes to, the quote unquote ufological value, if I want to go there, I think there's other stuff going on.
Yeah.
But he's important. He's he's important in the history, right? Because of the influence that he's had. I think that's what's really important, right? This move, as we talked about earlier, sort of seeing all paranormal phenomena as a unity, as a unified field. You find that articulated very early in Jacques Vallee, especially, I mean, beginning kind of intuitively in Passport to Magonia, and then explicitly in Invisible College in 1975, around the same time that John Keel was coming up with the same idea.
Mm-hmm. What's the role of Twin Peaks?
What is the role of Twin Peaks? Oh, it's a place to retreat to when you need to see a work of televisual art. Yeah, I know what you're referring to. Yeah, Twin Peaks is of course is wonderful. Because it's a precursor to anyone who doesn't see that Agent Dale Cooper is a precursor to Agent Mulder is not paying attention, number one. But number two, what's interesting about Twin Peaks is the way that David Lynch weaves in Project Blue Book. I think that's already in the second season, and then this gets played out with much more aplomb in the third season. And of course, this segues into the similarities to Trinity as well, because what happens in season 3 is that the Trinity test seems, of course, with a David Lynch film, it's always going, well, I think this is what's going on. It seems to open an interdimensional gateway, if you will, where some form of cosmic evil makes its way into the earth in the form of eggs. There's this weird creature that vomits out this great slimy stream of something full of eggs, and these eggs land in the American Southwest, and these weird little creatures hop out, and I don't know where that ends up, but also the creatures that come through this portal are these weird lumberjacks. And they crack. It's interesting how they squish people's heads. This is interesting. But there's also a point where actually not Dale Cooper, but his boss, I forget what the character's name is, but it's played by David Lynch. They actually ascend into this space. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on there. And actually Eric Wargo, who is someone who deserves both awe and respect. The man's website is called The Night Shirt, and the stuff he writes there is just, I don't know how the man does it. It's intelligent, learned, clear, insightful, groundbreaking. He too was invited to speak at the Rice University conference, but not as a plenary speaker. But he writes a very, very, very interesting reading of Twin Peaks and its relation to the ufological. But Lynch makes something totally his own out of it, as we would expect, because it's got something to do with the White Lodge and the Black Lodge. And the Black Lodge is this evil place. But if you remember the end of season 2, anyone who hasn't seen it, it's a place where, like in any sort of abduction scenario or a fairy abduction scenario, time is dilated.
Yes.
It's marvelous the way that he depicts these things. Yeah, there's something going on there. Where he gets it from, well, it's Lynch. He's all right-brained. It's probably just beamed into him, from Ashtar Command. I don't know, but it's a wonderful, wonderful addition to the whole mythology. But it is sui generis. It's really its own thing. Just endlessly delicious. I actually was rereading my mention of that today, because I try to link that up to the Trinity book, because Trinity came out at the same time that the Twin Peaks season 3 came out, and it was quite synchronicitous that I saw that episode very soon after having read Trinity, and I try to draw the parallels between the two.
Yes.
There aren't that many, but they're there because there's an egg, and the thing that was supposedly crashed in Trinity is an avocado, and of course, avo, egg, is an egg-shaped thing, and that it's an egg-shaped thing. I mean, Vallee is smart enough to know that the egg is an important alchemical symbol. Go to your Jung, look up egg. And the egg is it's an important mythological, alchemical, archetypical symbol. And right there, there's a lot to run with. What does that have to do with a real thing that may have landed in the desert? Nothing. What's it got to do with how we think about these things? Everything. This is the spontaneous mythopoetic imagination at work.
Yep. Well, I think I've interrogated you enough, but I hope to continue this discussion.
Yes, me too. But next time I hope to turn the tables on you a little bit more.
Okay.
To sort of put our mutual takes on things together, because your take is it's similar to mine, but again a bit different from mine, because you're much more critical of things.
Right. I'm looking for the I'm looking for the unassailable evidence.
Well, we'll look in. I'll check with my friend Mike Sifoni about that. Maybe we'll find a case that we can all chew over together. That would be rewarding, I think. But I hope that we can salvage something worthwhile from this conversation. I think a lot of good ideas came up, and a lot of things were covered.
Yep.
And like I say, the story goes on. There is no season finale. There's no series finale. So there'll always be something new to talk about. Okay, Luis, it was good to talk to you. Good to make your acquaintance. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thanks so much for talking to me.
Well, thank you very much. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.